came to New York in 1982 for art school. I came to New York for art school at the School of Visual Arts in New York, and then shortly after that attended the Whitney Independent Study Program. And I think through that context at that time, the mid-'80s, I met extraordinary artists at that time that were very involved in critique, institutional critique, discussions around site specificity, feminism, and a political content in art. And that was very much, that theoretical and political environment was very much what influenced me in my early years. Shortly after that, I became associated with a gallery called American Fine Arts Company. And that's where I further started to develop my work in New York. Again, thinking very, very much about classical notions of site specificity and where we could take that. That was my initial impetus, was to sort of expand the notions of site specificity. So I was working on, early on, large-scale projects, typically sometimes outdoors. I was showing quite a bit in Europe as a young artist, and developing these ideas around formalism and issues of public space relative to particular sites. And I think that has continued throughout my work to varying degrees. It's certainly present here in this show, but that thread of dealing with the notion of site and where I'm standing and issues of sort of specificity. In the early 90s, from the late 80s I would say to the early 90s, I was very much thinking about public space in relationship to what a public is and different publics. I was interested in the notion of gay subjectivity as we would have thought about it then. And I was interested in public spaces like parks. And I did an entire series of smaller works that were based on parks in New York, parks other places, Central Park in particular, with the area called the Ramble that Frederick Law Olmsted had designed to be the most naturalistic part of the park. It's complete artifice, but he designed it to look as if it had been an existing landscape. And that is also a gay cruising area and a heavily trafficked bird watching area. So I was interested in these two publics that frequent this spot, and that's what culminated in this 1993 piece in American Garden that I did for Zonsbeck 93, this large international show in Zonsbeck in Arnhem, the Netherlands. And shortly after that, Circa 77 was a project I worked on at the Kunsthalle in Zurich, Switzerland, and it also dealt with this notion of spaces that were used by gay people, gay men specifically, to meet one another, to cruise, to have sex. And I wasn't interested in that, and I'm still not interested in it as some sort of an emancipatory gesture. I was interested in the fact that this coincided in public spaces and put into question the notion of neutral publics, and started to open up the idea that there are very many different publics, and that the definition necessarily has to be a plural one. I think also around that time, I started becoming very involved. My work had always had a very strong relationship to minimalism and the legacies of minimalism. So I was always interested in taking that blank form or seemingly blank form and expanding it and relating it to architectural spaces, spaces of containment, spaces of control, spaces of comfort and confinement as well. So I did these earlier works that were always about the notion of public and plurality. And I always, myself was never really present in these works, with the exception of the fact that because, particularly at this time period, this is in the late 80s and early 90s, into the mid-90s, to say that you were dealing with gay subject matter was something that spoke very loudly. And so it carried through all the time. People would see the work through this lens. And I was very much framed by that. So that at a certain point in around early 2000s, I decided to deal with this notion of the figure, of the persona. And I first wanted to deal with Truman Capote, for instance, American author Truman Capote. And I was I think the show was in 2005, the complete works of Truman Capote that I did at a gallery in Rome. I started to think about not that persona as a full totalizing figure, but a fractured, decaying figure. And I went on to think about other figures, always with myself in mind. It's when I started to work with these sort of minimalist forms, these hinged forms that would prop, lean, rest, had all of these sorts of, the language of minimalism and post-minimalism was very active with these pieces as well. And I think that carries forward into this exhibition, where I've often tried to think about a figure that could be almost an entrance point for me, that allows me to speak through and into certain ideas, certain materials. And with Oiticica, Elia Oiticica, for this exhibition, that was the figure that I wanted to sort of inhabit or embody, and sort of imagine my subjectivity in relationship to his, and not just his work, but also he as a person, and then maybe more as a persona even. And with this project at Auroras, I really wanted to get very close to the notion of him, where our works start to become a little bit collapsed one into the other, fold into one into the other. I think there were a number of reasons that I was drawn to use Oiticica. Many reasons, actually. They all seem to kind of coincide. I was interested in the fact that he had traveled between Brazil and the States, New York specifically. I was interested in the fact that he had a performative aspect to his work. Performance and audience was very important to him. But I was also interested in that he came out of real formalism, that he came out of, you know, the neo-concrete movement in Brazil, which is also very interesting to me in relationship to my work, and I've always paralleled and made myself in relationship to American and European minimalism, but I've always thought very much about this movement in Brazil, but had never really kind of folded that back into my work. And coming here gave me that opportunity to think about his work a bit more deeply, and not simply these parallels, but also these differences. What I was interested in was the difference not just between he and I, but also between the time periods. So if he's exploring notions of potential and experimentation, which is all very much bound up in the notion of liberation, he's coming out of working in a particular artistic moment that had everything to do with early moments of women's liberation, of gay liberation. We're in a very different time now. So I was more interested in things that I'm interested in my work have much more to do with control, with lack of possibilities in some way, which I hope open up possibilities, but I focus on the ways in which we are constructed and controlled and seemingly without possibilities often. Though I think ultimately I look for the cracks in things, and everything has some sort of a crack that you can, but I don't think it's wide open the way this kind of drug moment in a certain way too, this notion of psychedelia, that anything was possible, that you could. So I was interested in sort of registering, by taking him on, registering the difference between the 1960s. The late 1950s is when he was doing these drawings that I based the work on here, but then later in the 60s, these famous works that he did into the 70s that had to do with the breakdown of form, the malleability of form. And that intrigued me very much in terms of in relationship to coming here. And coming here in relationship to this notion of control was very interesting for me, because there are these situations that one is brought into in the art world or in one's career where you're invited somewhere and it's this notion of doing, you know, do whatever you want, right? There's still this mythology of freedom that exists, you know, in relationship to art. But of course, I recognize immediately all the parameters, the limitations, and I don't just mean time and space, which are frameworks and limitations, but also what it's even possible to say. I'm more interested in trying to think about the edges of what surrounds me and frames me, rather than thinking about bursting through them. You mentioned, you know, in 2017, I did a year-long project in New Haven, Connecticut, which happened to be my hometown. I chose this location because it was my hometown. And this was a large brutalist building designed by Marcel Breuer in 1970, and very, very different kind of context. But I was absorbed by that for a year. And I thought about how to inhabit it and with certain figures. So moving here, thinking about doing the project here, equally resonant, equally strong, pronounced kind of environment that has not just a modernist house, but has a long history, that's still very much present, of the people who have lived here, generations who have lived here. It has a lot of, I won't say ghosts, but it has a lot of content. You know, it hasn't been stripped of all of its content. So I think that's a very interesting kind of space to work with, because whether I point to it or not, these things are visible in the space, and my work is necessarily going to be seen in relationship to some of this history and some of this content. But it's also not simply that, it's the fact that I actually produced the work here, right? So this became this collapse between some sort of classical notion of studio and exhibition space, the two things which are typically more disparate phases or spaces or steps or stages, became kind of collapsed one into the other. And I thought of that as in a certain way as a kind of performance in a certain way. So I thought about the whole project in terms of a narrative where there were certain characters. I certainly was one of the characters. Coming here, being the artist, I'm always implicitly the character in my own work. Whether I decide to say that or not, it's expected. Waitasika, this other character, is almost a surrogate for me. Someone whose shoes I can step into. Someone who allows me to have a presence in this context where I'm a foreign agent, where I'm a foreign artist. I don't speak the language, and yet I can sort of inhabit, if not Elio's body, I can inhabit his practice to a certain degree. So I can absorb my own into his in a certain way and sort of make that something of a strange, almost romantic context or sexualized context between the two men. And then the third character is the house itself, which is very much the frame for what I'm doing. And it can be said that any space, whether you want to use the term classic white cube or neutral space, any space has this ability to define what the project is, whether you want to deal with this explicitly, which I sometimes do, sometimes don't, or whether you're simply hanging paintings on a wall. That context necessarily defines how that work is read and becomes a part of the work, whether one sees it, as I say, explicitly or not. With this space, it's so articulated, right? It's still somewhat residential. It's a hybrid space, which interests me. It's between things. It's between an exhibition space and a residential space. And that allowed me to sort of tweak out certain things in relationship to it that allowed the house itself to sort of enunciate. The house starts to speak as well. The windows upstairs of this house, the exterior shutters, were something that I started to think about a lot in relationship to barriers and protection, the two, and also in relationship to the notion of a membrane or a skin of a house. That also became very fascinating to me. Like, where does the the public space and the private space, where's that membrane between the two? And of course, I was also very interested in the kind of almost I won't say xenophobic, but somewhat anxious relationship that a house like this, a modernist house in an affluent neighborhood, has to its surroundings. There's a kind of almost architectural paranoia that has to do with protectionism, that has to do with the many gates one has to get through to get here. And then that's juxtaposed against this glass window, which is all about ease, because now you're in the comfortable space. So I knew I wanted to deal with some of those parameters in some way. So if there are these three components or these three characters in this sort of narrative that I've constructed, myself, which is very much woven throughout all the work, but maybe most visibly exemplified by the t-shirts, my own clothing, using my own clothing in a very self-conscious manner, almost shedding my skin here. Which has lots of implications. Then the Elio screen, that is this direct appropriation of an early work of Waitasika's that happens to be the same year as this house was built. So one thing always triggers the next, triggers the next, triggers the next. And I did know that I wanted to work with something very, very clearly from the house. It's true, I went down several paths about the notion of furniture based on other projects I had done, which is often how it starts. You know, I think that I'm going to do what I did before, and then I get into a different space when I'm actually here, because to be in this house is completely differently than working with the model that I had at home, and the many photographs, right? To actually be here, to be here at night, to be sleeping here, all of those things had a sort of profound effect on what I ultimately wanted to make. So finally, at some point, although it's only been 2 weeks, so I guess it was not that long ago, I saw these large benches outside that almost felt like handmade Tom Burr works in a certain way. They seem to almost feel like the kind of thing I would make if I were to do that. And so I stained them black. They're these long, heavy farm benches almost that have this kind of brutality to them. And then they're slightly anthropomorphic in that they have these strange little legs on the end. So they have this kind of almost anthropomorphic quality. Stained them black. They were sort of scattered around the garden. One was hidden in the side garden. And I decided to sort of put them in a very tight configuration that would allow people to think about their bodies quite a bit, having to negotiate them and find their way around them. And then I wanted to have them further articulate something. So I was actually prompted by your use of the poem that I'd written in 2010, I want to say, untitled, but it's about, and you were using it for part of the press release, and that made me think this could be very, very interesting to see this on an object, to see this, because I wrote it for a magazine. It's never been, I've read it many times, but I've never anchored it physically somewhere. And I thought how interesting, because it also talks about physicality. It talks about the material world, and it's very much about the conditions I find in life and the relationship between perhaps psychological impulses and physical impulses. So we printed those texts to be placed on the benches so that one had to think about your body while reading, and maybe think about reading through your body in a certain way. And the poem also makes a strong reference to the material concrete, which has been something that's been a recurring sort of obsession of mine for a very long time, and came to sort of full fruition in my project in New Haven, which was in this Marcel Breuer building, which was concrete, and which was all about the aestheticization of concrete and the whole dialogues and debates and controversies that would end up being around brutalist architecture from this period. But also, if you sort of shift, and I pull it in this direction and I present it here in these references to concrete, you can't help but think about neo-concrete and the references to abstraction in Brazil in the 1950s, 1960s. So this started to play on both sides. You know, this started to move in two different directions at once, making reference perhaps to these heavy wood brutalist benches, but also the other issues that I'm starting to think about inside on the other works. Yeah, they kind of produce a more phenomenological sort of experience. And what I wanted that to also do was that the audience, of course, becomes the final component in any work, I think. There's still this way that we look at flat works on the wall where we become disembodied. We disconnect ourselves from that object. When an object is in space, somehow one starts to engage it differently. Perhaps it's as simple as the fact that one walks around it, right? But I think it's also about this sort of object being prostate and kind of encountering verticality. So I wanted to play with that a bit. And yes, I'm hoping that experience of the concrete configuration and the Helio screen are ones that make people very self-conscious about their movements and their occupying a space and their viewing, but I also want that to shadow over and to blend onto the other experience, so that perhaps when you're looking at these other images, when you're looking at the objects with the t-shirts on them, you're as aware of your own body as you are when you're with the others, and perhaps somewhat self-conscious of your own physicality in the space. I think another strong work tendency for me, or part of my practice for a very, very long time, has been the notion of collage. I like to put things next to each other, next to other things, next to other things, next to other things to make a whole. I'm interested in fragments much more than I am about any kind of pure form. I like to see things having many components. So these bulletin boards that I've done for many, many years, and they started as sort of almost supplemental material, research materials that I was using for these larger sculptures. I ended up sort of making a board out of them. And then it turned into a practice of its own, where they didn't any longer have to have a reference to another project. They became a project in and of themselves. And at a certain point, I started to incorporate objects, specifically clothing, into these. Not always my own, but often my own clothing. It would go back and forth. But very typically my own clothing. And this was during a very specific period of time. And I did these t-shirts earlier, some years ago, but I made the panels smaller then because I wanted the panels to be the architecture. So here I am in this box, in this piece of architecture, in this house. I wanted to mimic that in the panel so that I was contained within it. Those are the limits of what is there. And with these panels, I decided to make them slightly bigger because I wanted to sort of expand and collage, juxtapose, make sort of some sort of a radical juxtaposition between these t-shirts that I had worn while I was here and some other material that would change the t-shirts, take the t-shirts somewhere else. So I'm always interested in, I've always toyed with extended legacies of American minimalism and European minimalism to a certain degree. And I've always thought about, when I was coming here, can I take that and turn it just a little bit to make it almost referencing Brazilian histories that were parallel histories, parallel structures to the structures I've often thought about. And then, of course, infusing them with this kind of psychological, emotional kind of energy, references. When I started doing these blanket works, as I guess we call them now, I think it was 2008. And I did them at that moment to kind of counteract what was I considered more architectural, colder, conceptual works that I was making. I wanted to all of a sudden do something that was about soft form to a certain degree. I wanted to do something that seemed feminine on some level, in that it was a little bit plain rather than the history of some of these sort of macho minimalists. I was interested perhaps in artists who had worked with fabric and the kind of, to a certain degree, cliches of femininity. So I became interested in using some sort of fabric. I early on chose that it would be a blanket. I chose that the panels would be the height that I am as just a general parameter. And then the fabrics were about protection to a certain degree. Because they are blankets, they're about some sort of notion of comfort and protection. I also liked these particular gray blankets because they seemed to walk on both sides of the street. They could be that on the one hand, but then they could also look a little bit like Savile Row in London, like fine men's suits. They have that implication, particularly when they're pinned and they're in relationship to my scale. Here, I wanted some other material that it was going to, I very strongly wanted something that would deal with the notion of the windows in this house. I thought about curtains quite a bit. I thought about what that would be. I thought about that when I went to the glass house here. I thought about the sort of shears, classic window coverings, modernist window coverings. None of it quite clicked with me exactly, that it didn't quite say quite what I wanted to and look the way I wanted it to. And then when I found this material, it did both. It had meaning. It referenced the windows that they were sitting next to. It referenced notions of privacy, notions of exposure, notions of voyeurism, notions of privilege and protection. And yet it also had an uncanny kind of physicality that I could play with, that had something to do with almost a kind of strange perversion. It has almost a latex quality. It has a skin-like quality. And that kind of skin-like quality juxtaposes against this, I think, this rougher blanket material, not in not such a dissimilar way than skin encounters a fabric like that. So to put the two things together took them somewhere else that starts to be, maybe speak about issues of vulnerability at the same time. At the same time, yes, that it's a very slick material in some ways too, right? It has a shine to it. It has a surface that doesn't seem as porous as the blankets do, right? So yeah, it kind of repels at the same time that it draws you in. Actually parallels exactly what I just said about the larger pieces, that I had a given, which were the blankets, and then I wanted something else that would be the sort of juxtaposition that would take that somewhere else, that would come up against it. And I knew it, so I did know I would use the t-shirts. I brought those with me. I wore some of them while I was here working. That I knew. But I also gave myself this challenge, as I mentioned, that I made the panels larger than the confines of the t-shirt, so I needed something else. I couldn't back out of it. And I knew I wanted some material. I knew I wanted it to be printed, or I wanted it to be print material. I had this idea that I wanted it, if the t-shirts were going to be quite blank, formally, they don't, for instance, none of my t-shirts have any writing on them. There are no logos that you can really see too easily. They're quite blank, and I'm aware that they have a lot of information on them, but it's not. And so I wanted something that was going to be then very heavy, a lot of content, a lot of referencing, but I didn't quite know what that was. I was interested, this is coming out of the current political climate, both here and where I'm from in the United States. I was interested in the legacies of queer liberations, queer movements, queer actions. So I was interested in being near this idea, but I also didn't know what that material would be exactly. I knew I had to source it here. I got lots of books that started to have to do with sexuality and about the framing of sexuality. And I chose a couple of different books for these texts that I took, the texts that actually took the pages out of the books. I used the actual pages. That had to do less with, let's say, the other, like, let's just say, it's not a text of liberation. This is not about people giving voice to subcultures or oppressed people. These texts are coming from the mainstream about the other, and that interested me. They're much the same as sort of controlling architectural spaces. And there's humor in them. They're from the late 70s, and they typically are about, there's a certain erotic quality to them. So they'll talk about all forms of heterosexual relationships and love and marriage, and they're peppered with lots of kind of soft, almost soft porn kinds of images throughout, you know, typical of the late 1970s, you know, very attractive white young men and women. And then there'll be these subcategories, which are the deviances. And this is the 1970s, it's the late 1970s, it's not the 1950s. In a moment that's supposed to be about liberation, but there'll be these sort of deviances that, which of course, it's broken down into homosexuality, female homosexuality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also the other quality that I wanted to sort of play with there is that I found this one book that had some of the information that's started to interest me. It had captions and sub-captions that were quite literal, but they could shift. If you took them out of context, they could go this way, or they could go that way, and they could apply to more people than they were intending them to be. But then I found one that was printed on yellow paper, so it also then gave me this other formal device to start to use, so that it wasn't simply ever really just about what was being said, it was also how it was being said, and what those formal pages started to do. Rather than just being read, they could just be looked at. They could just be taken in as a form at the same time as, you know, and it's a little bit like, because they're in the guise of medical books, right? They're called medical archives, is the name of these books. And so it's, you know, sexuality is a longer conversation, but it's often been framed within medical discourse. Certainly homosexuality has been, but all sexuality has been. It's been problematized. It's been turned into a problem that has to be then treated. But I obscured most of the texts and just used edges of them. So they're just bits of it and clues, and it almost becomes a sign for this kind of information rather than me giving any real information. I always wrote, even when I was young, but I always wrote. I don't draw very well. I can draw with a ruler, but I'm not really very comfortable expressing my ideas through drawings. I never have. So I tend to write for myself. It used to be in books. Now it's often notes, digital notes. But I write and I write and I write and I write ideas over and over again, and titles and possibilities and things, and maybe of all of that, a fraction of it becomes the physical artwork. But then I also started to write quite a bit, starting in the 90s, about my own work, about other work. I was very influenced, as I think I said at the top of the interview, by particularly critical theory and particularly feminism and women who were working at that time, and not simply women, but primarily women, who were also using language at this time. I'm talking about Martha Rosler, I'm talking about Barbara Kruger, I'm talking about Jenny Holzer, I'm talking about Dara Birnbaum, and I'm talking about Craig Owens, who is an important instructor of mine and theorist and friend, who was very influential for me in relationship to the idea of a postmodernism that could be about what we would call today intersectionality and this composition of subjectivities. So writing seemed to be an important element of my education too. And I also felt very empowered by the notion of writing. I think there's a traditional myth, sometimes it's a reality, as it is with all myths, that artists, that there's a breakdown of labor in the art world, right? And artists make art, and then there are other people who should be writing about that art. Yes, I like when other people write about my art, and I desire that. But I also desire to have, there's certain things I can say through language that I can't say, and I don't want to be limited by simply sculptural or painterly form. Yeah, and then at a certain point they just sort of accumulated and started to become more and more. And I'm actually very, I was somewhat slow to recognize that was actually a significant part of my practice, because it was sort of something that was so natural to how I used to work. And as I say, maybe the only parallel analogy might be someone who sketches a lot and doesn't take the sketches very seriously because they're not the end product yet. But at a certain point, and also when I described how I came to the bulletin boards, they were always supplemental for a certain period of time. I never thought that they were the thing. And then I decided to make them as much, that bulletin board on the wall could have as much heft and importance as that large-scale outdoor sculpture. Similarly, I wanted to do the same thing with writing. At a certain point, I wanted it to not just be in the service of my other work, but it is also my work.